Also, we're going to enter into our time of Q&A. So if you guys would like to come up and grab a seat or stand, whatever you guys feel more comfortable. And the way we're going to do this, we're going to put a QR code up on the screen. If you guys have a question, you can click on that and enter it when it takes you to the place to do that, and it'll pop up with the computer. But we also have, we'll have Kyle walking around with a microphone, and he will ask some questions as well. So if you see him, flag him down. There's the two ways that you can ask any question. So the first question is, there is an effort underway to clone a woolly mammoth in the next 5 years. Is there any realistic way that this can be accomplished?
Yeah, that's a project that is part of the whole idea of trying to resurrect extinct species. And I don't know that people are trying to clone the woolly mammoth, but what they are doing is using the woolly mammoth genome. We actually have a completed genome now for the woolly mammoth. And the view is that the woolly mammoth is most closely related to an Asian elephant. And so what we can do is take the genome of an Asian elephant, compare it to that of the woolly mammoth, and note the genetic differences, and then use a technique called CRISPR gene editing to convert the Asian elephant genome into a woolly mammoth-like genome. So this would all be done in basically Asian elephant embryos, and then once you do the gene modification, you could implant that embryo into an Asian elephant womb as a surrogate, with the idea that you could potentially give birth to a woolly mammoth. So it's not really cloning, it's more using genetic engineering techniques to convert an Asian elephant to be like a woolly mammoth. And it's very hard to find any kind of real justification for why you would want to do that work, other than the scientific novelty of seeing if you could do it, right? There's some thought that, well, maybe if you could resurrect the woolly mammoths, they might be able to use them to populate the tundra in Siberia, and that could actually have ecological benefits. That to me seems to be probably a little bit misguided, a little naive to think that you could do something like that, assuming you could pull it off. But many people are critical of the work because they just see it as a type of animal cruelty. There's really no justifiable end to doing that work. So it's been soundly criticized just by animal welfare advocates. But that is a real project that's going on.
Okay.
Well, I concur with Fuzz that this is something we should not pursue. There was a research paper published in Canada about a decade ago making the point that yes, humans did wipe out the woolly mammoth, but if we hadn't wiped out the woolly mammoth, the forests in Siberia and Canada would have been destroyed by the woolly mammoth. So it's thanks to the extinction of the woolly mammoth, we still have forests in Canada and Siberia. And the combination of Siberia and Canada is actually more than half the forest cover of the planet. So maybe we should think twice about bringing back the woolly mammoth. I'm okay with them being in a zoo, but I don't want to turn them loose in the Canadian tundra or the Siberian tundra.
All right. Next question is, climate change has become highly politically biased. With your expertise in science, share your truth about climate change, and what ways do you think we can do better to protect our planet?
Well, I'll get a start on that because I actually written a book on it, Weathering Climate Change. And my motivation for writing the book is that it's highly politicized. And basically, the climate change debate is driven by people saying that we have to choose between what's for our benefit and the benefit of the planet. And that's counter to what Fuzz just shared with you a few minutes ago. Genesis says that God put humans in charge of the planet to manage its resources for our benefit and the benefit of all their life. That implies that God has designed our planet in such a way that we will never be between a rock and a hard place where we have to choose what's good for us or what's good for the environment. There will be solutions that are good for both. We just need to find them. And I like the other thing that Fuzz was sharing. We humans are fundamentally selfish. So for example, we could pass laws here in the US where we don't burn any fossil fuels. We do everything we can to stabilize the climate. But what's going to stop the other nations of the world from saying, hey, the Americans are making the sacrifices, we don't have to. People will cheat. We know that because every time we've tried to encourage people to lower their standard of living, all we do is we produce a black market. People find a workaround against the laws. And so we already have black market problems all over the planet today. So we need to take that into account. And so what I've done in my book is to say there are ways we can stabilize the climate while we boost the world's economy and while we maximally benefit the ecosystems of the world. There really are win-win-win solutions that are out there, and based on the biblical principle that God has provided them. We just need to look for them. And in October, I was in India, and I was shocked by the amount of air pollution in India. I mean, there are cities in India where you can't see the moon, even when it's up in the sky because of the amount of light pollution, but particularly the particulate matter pollution. And that's because they get almost all their energy from burning coal, wood, and biofuels. And it's not just India. That's true of almost all of Asia, China, India, Pakistan. And what has now been released by the World Health Organization is that the average lifespan of people living in the Ganges Valley, 460 million people live in the Ganges Valley. And because of their exposure to particulate matter pollution, their lifespan is being shortened by 8 years on average. In Delhi, it's 12 years. Of all of Asia, it's 3.5 years. For the entire continent of Asia, it's 3.5 years. Now, we don't see any of that here in America or Canada or Western Europe. Why? Because now we have stopped burning coal and wood and biofuels, and we're burning natural gas instead. Natural gas is cheaper than coal, cheaper than wood, and it has no particulate matter pollution. And so I wrote an article. It just got posted Monday before last, making the point that we in North America are sitting upon more than 80% of the natural gas reserves of the world. Unfortunately, our government at the end of January passed a law saying we're no longer going to allow the building of natural gas ports where they convert natural gas into a liquid form and ship it to the different nations of the world. There's a ban on that because our government thinks all fossil fuels are bad. And it's like when you burn natural gas, you get half the greenhouse gas emissions. When you burn coal, it's carbon dioxide. When you burn natural gas, it's carbon dioxide and water vapor. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas, but it precipitates as rain and snow. So you put more water vapor in the atmosphere, no problem. It's the carbon dioxide that's the problem. You cut the greenhouse gas emissions by half when you burn natural gas. There's no particulate matter pollution. And so we could ship natural gas to Asia, and they would now have their people living 3 to 8 to 12 years longer than they live already. They would save a huge amount of money on their health costs, and the natural gas would be cheaper. And so it would boost their economy. And what would it do to our economy? We'd be the ones selling the natural gas, so it'd be a huge boost to our economy. Now, I do agree with the global warming alarmists in saying eventually we need to get our energy from other sources besides burning fossil fuels. But we can't do that overnight. The solution I really favor is thorium nuclear reactors. Not uranium reactors, thorium reactors. The advantage of thorium reactors, you get 300 times as much energy per ton of thorium that you do per ton of uranium. It's impossible to have a meltdown in a thorium nuclear reactor. You can make nuclear weapons with a thorium nuclear reactor, but it will kill you if you try to make them. So no one's going to make them, because whoever makes them is going to die in the process. And so, which means we could give thorium nuclear reactors to North Korea and not worry that they're going to turn that into making nuclear weapons. And with uranium nuclear reactors, you've got radioactive waste that remains toxic to the environment for 50,000 years. For thorium, it's 50 to 200 years. That's manageable. And the people in the thorium nuclear reactor power plants don't have to wear protective gear. The miners don't either. And by the way, there's 3 times as much thorium in the earth than there is uranium. Much cheaper to mine. In fact, I argue that if we were to get our energy from thorium nuclear reactors, it would be less than half the price of water power, which is the cheapest form of energy on the planet today. But that will take about 10 years to make happen. In the meantime, I would argue that the United States and Canada needs to get busy to upgrade their natural gas production, supply it to the world. It would boost the world's economy. It would certainly help the ecosystems because the ecosystems wouldn't be exposed to all that particulate matter pollution. That's just 2 of the solutions that are in the book. There's 38 others. We could basically shrink the Sahara Desert down to 1/10 of its present size. We can do that in 1 generation. I also argue we need to let the lumber companies go into our national parks. Have you visited the Western National Parks? 1/3 of the trees are dead. And tourists don't like dead trees. And by the way, the wildlife doesn't like dead trees either. The wildlife would do a whole lot better if they had healthy forests. The reason why there's all those dead trees, we let the trees grow without being harvested. Hence, the trees are so dense and so numerous, they can't fight off the bark beetles. If we had lumber companies come in and thin out the trees, now the trees would be able to get enough water from the soil to fight out the bark beetles. You wouldn't have all those dead trees. Or the Amazon. Let's go into the Amazon. Instead of cutting down the trees, we selectively harvest the big old trees. Those big old trees only pull 1/3 of the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere as the young trees do. And it's those big old trees where you make the most money. That's where you can get, 8-foot diameter trees. You can make some really nice furniture out of that. Instead of letting the trees die and release greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, you harvest them, and now you've got furniture and homes that are going to last hundreds of years. So I would stop the greenhouse gas emissions, replace the old trees with young trees. You pull up to 4 times as many greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and you make way more money than if you try to cut down the trees and put it into pasture land. Those are just a few examples of how we can resolve climate change while we boost the world economy, and we don't have to have the politicians involved. If you've got an economic incentive, we don't need politicians. But people have said, Hugh, aren't you naive? Don't politicians like power? Yeah, they do. So that's the remaining problem. We've got to figure out a way to have the politicians say, you know what? There's other things that we can do besides getting overly involved in something that doesn't need our attention.
Okay. Do we have let's take a question from the crowd. Just raise your hand and Kyle will come over and give you the microphone.
This is for Hugh. I'd like to get your take on the CERN in Geneva, Switzerland, specifically the Bose particle.
Okay, CERN is a big particle accelerator, 17 miles in circumference, and it actually sits in both France and Switzerland. That's how big it is. And yes, the goal of CERN was to actually get us closer to the unified field theory. It was a particle accelerator outside of Chicago that demonstrated how we can unify electromagnetism and the weak nuclear force. They pulled that off in the 1970s. CERN is much bigger. I mean, Fermi was just 4 miles. CERN is 17 miles. And so the goal was to see, can we get a little bit further towards the unification of the electroweak force with a strong nuclear force. So the whole thing was to pursue the unified field theory that got started by Albert Einstein. So it's not going to get us all the way there. To get all the way there, you need a particle accelerator 40 trillion miles long. So the chances of that being funded soon is not very realistic. So, but they did find the Higgs boson, and that was a major goal of building it because it is powerful enough to detect the Higgs boson, and in 2 years they found the Higgs boson. And the Higgs boson explains how protons and neutrons and electrons have mass. So it solved the mass problem of particle physics. And now they're trying to use CERN to find the particles that make up dark matter. And they're in a race with the astronomers. The astronomers are trying to find these dark matter particles by looking at white dwarf binary stars. CERN is trying to find it by duplicating the high energy densities that we think would show us the decay products of dark matter particles. As it is right now, the only dark matter particles that have been discovered are neutrinos, but we know they make up only a tiny percentage of the dark matter. So I'm predicting within a decade we'll have identified the primary particle that makes up dark matter. But we already know dark matter is real because we can see its gravitational influence.
Okay, thank you. So this next question is for Dr. Rana. You mentioned we as Christians need to interact and participate with the emerging technologies. Other than reasons.org, what resources are available to stay current with the new findings?
Yeah, well, if you just, I think, spend some time on the internet, you're going to encounter all kinds of articles that are published that are, science in the news type articles that will describe what's happening in biotechnology. Those tend to be topics that people are very interested in, and, science writers will communicate. So, there's not a shortage of places to go where you can find out what's happening, but there's really not a lot of places to go where you can get a framework to begin to think about how to handle these emerging technologies. And so, I think it's really important at this juncture to have principles in mind as to how do you engage, these technologies. And, the Christian worldview actually gives a really powerful framework for us to begin to think about this. I mentioned some of the ideas, today that, as image bearers, we have dominion over the creation. There are things that we, I think, have a God-given right to work on, to do, to promote human flourishing and also to care for the environment. But we also recognize that there are boundaries that we don't want to cross, right? We don't want to do anything that's going to actually undermine the dignity or the sanctity of human life, right? We've been given dominion over the creation. We've not been given dominion over human beings, which means that that's a very hard and fast boundary. We want to be interested in questions about justice, right? Is this technology going to be improve people's lives? Are people going to have access to the technology? Or is it going to be technology that will be concentrated in the hands of a select few that are wealthy, right? So those are concerns that we would have. Or what impact is this technology going to have on the environment? I mentioned very briefly lab meat. One of the most controversial articles I've written for our website is about lab meat. I can't believe the reactions that I've received from people about lab meat. And the primary motivation for producing lab meat is that animal agriculture is very hard on the environment, and that you are dealing with factory farming, which is really cruel and inhumane. And so there are very good reasons why people want to try to use lab meat as a source of protein as opposed to getting that meat directly from animals. But on the other hand, there are studies now that are emerging that are arguing that the claims about lab meat actually improving the environment may not be valid, that lab meat may actually be more harmful to the environment than animal farming, or animal agriculture, sorry. So we've got to do a very careful assessment to make sure that we really are properly taking care of the environment as we pursue the technology. So to me, it's more important to understand a framework, how to think about it, than really going to somebody and asking them, how should I respond to this? I really want to try to encourage Christians to have those principles in hand that they can then utilize to themselves make a determination as to whether or not this is a technology worth pursuing. Because I can tell you this from my limited experience engaging transhumanism, or as I'm beginning to think about the whole issues with biotechnology and synthetic biology, these are very complex issues that people who share the same Christian faith, the same commitment to the authority of Scripture, who are actually pro-science and technology, can literally have deep disagreements about what is our response as Christians to these technologies. This is something that we've got to wrestle through as a community and work through as a community. It's not just this pat answer that anybody can give. So to me, I would really encourage you to think about this and think about what principles can I pull from Scripture that help me to think about this. And I think we also need to make sure we really understand the technology. A lot of times there's a superficial understanding of the technology and a perception about what the technology entails as opposed to a deep understanding. And so we've all got to do a little bit of work rolling up our sleeves and making sure that we really know what's going on with the technology.
All right, next question. It's how do you feel about IVF, specifically the creation of multiple embryos that may be frozen indefinitely or discarded?
You know, this is a great example of just the point that I made, is that we really need to understand what's going on and we need to think deeply about it. I mean, on the surface, there's not, in principle, anything wrong with in vitro fertilization, right? The people that do this are people that love each other. They want to have children. There's a very high value on human life that they're placing, and that's motivating, IVF procedures. So in that sense, in principle, I don't see any kind of real issue with it. However, when you look at how it's actually practiced, I've gone over the last 20 years from being really okay with IVF to really having some serious questions. Is this something that Christians should really take part in? And for the reasons that are alluded to in the question, is that when you are doing in vitro fertilization, it's very hard on the woman to provide the eggs that are needed. So usually it's a limited number of limited procedures that are performed where you get as many eggs as you can and you fertilize as many as you possibly can, right? Because there is an element of hit and miss to it. And then now you've got all these embryos, which are more than you could ever reasonably bring to full term. So, and then when you are doing the implantation, many times you have to implant more than you think could reasonably be brought to full term. And so what do you do with the leftover embryos, right? They typically are frozen, and eventually they're not going to be high enough quality. They're going to have to be destroyed. And then those embryos that you implant, if a large number of them actually result in a successful pregnancy, that woman may be forced to undergo selective reduction in the number of embryos and essentially selective abortions in order to ensure that some of those pregnancies will be able to go to full term. So for Christians going into this, if you take an embryo as being a person, which I do, you are creating human life that is going to be destroyed. You are implanting embryos that are going to be potentially aborted if there's too many that take hold. And so the practice of IVF really leads you into some very murky territory if you have a pro-life view. And again, if you think of an embryo or a fetus as being a human person, which again I do. So I think Christians really need to give very careful thought, frankly, before they start taking part in IVF procedures. Now, there are ways you could do it that doesn't create excess embryos where you're implanting one or two embryos. But that's going to make it very expensive, and it's going to be, again, the likelihood of success is going to dramatically diminish. But there are ways you could do it that would be sensitive to pro-life considerations. But another option that people have is to adopt, right? There's a real need to have Christians who would love a child to adopt a child. So there are alternatives beyond just simply, using technology to have a child. So, this is a sensitive issue. I think a lot of Christians go into IVF naively without really thinking through what kind of decisions they may have to confront. So anyway, it's something where I'm really less and less comfortable with the more that I think about it, the more I've learned about it.
Okay. So we have time for one more question. And so if we did not get to your question, they do a great job at emails, correct? Is that, if you have any questions, you could email them. So Dr. Ross, you knew that this question was going to be asked. Do you believe that we really went to the moon with the 1960s technology? And is Area 51 a real place?
Okay. We really did go to the moon, and we know that on a daily basis because the Apollo astronauts put 3 laser reflectors on the surface of the moon. And every day, physicists are shining laser beams on those reflectors in order to test theories of gravity. And I've written an article just a few weeks ago. You can see it at reasons.org in my blog series, Today's New Reason to Believe, about what these laser reflectors have done. It's amazing, but they've literally been using those laser reflectors ever since 1969. And I also have done on my Facebook page where I actually show you where we sent orbiters around the moon with high-resolution cameras. They're actually able to see the vehicles that have been left behind on the moon. Because with the later Apollo programs, they realized, hey, it's not easy to walk on the moon because of how weak the gravity is. So they said, hey, we want the astronauts to explore the moon. They can't walk. We got to give them a vehicle. Well, guess what? They left the vehicles behind. And we can see those vehicles to this very day. They're there. And you can go to the NASA website. You can go to other websites. I know people claim everything on the NASA website is a cheat. Well, the images they show on the NASA website, many amateurs around the world have photographed the same objects. So NASA's actually showing you real stuff. So, and what about Area 51?
Is it a real place?
Yes, it's a real place. And they made it twice as big because they wanted to keep the UFO people away from what they really don't want you to be investigating. But I can also tell you this, is that in one sense our government likes all the attention in Area 51 because the really secret stuff is not there at Area 51. I'm not going to tell you where the really secret stuff is because I don't want people going to those sites. But they think they can manage all the tourists. It's a really bleak desert area, and there's no trees around there, so it's easy to see the UFO buffs coming from a distance, and it's much easier for the government to handle them there than at the really secret sites. But they are doing some secret stuff at Area 51. But again, they made it twice as big to keep them sufficiently far away.
Yeah, Hugh could tell you where those secret places are, but then he'd have to kill all of us. So.
He brought me over and whispered, I'm like, your microphone's on. So, hey, let's give it a round of applause for Dr. Ross and Dr. Rana.
All right, thank you, Jed.